buen día, muchas gracias. Seguimos en el 7º Congreso de Lanzamiento de Campaña Gruesa de la Bolsa de Cereales de Buenos Aires. Hemos escuchado, recién terminó el panel de la apertura con las palabras del secretario de Agricultura, Juan José Bailio, y del presidente de la Bolsa de Cereales, José Martins. Resulta claro que esta campaña 2022-2023 se va a desarrollar en un contexto muy complejo, difícil desde el punto de vista climático, desde el punto de vista de los costos de producción, desde el punto de vista de la situación global con lo que es la guerra de Rusia de Ucrania y los distintos impactos que esto tiene en los costos de los insumos, en la posibilidad de contar con los mismos en tiempo y forma, no solamente en Argentina, sino en los restantes países también productores y exportadores de cereales. De esta manera pasamos a un primer panel en el cual vamos a hablar de la situación de la economía y de los mercados mundiales para ya empezar a trabajar cada una de estas cuestiones de manera más detallada. Vamos a arrancar hablando del mercado internacional, que está afectado, como decíamos, por factores disruptivos como son la guerra en Ucrania, que generó impactos en los precios y también en los flujos de comercio. Esta situación que elevó la preocupación en lo que es en términos de la seguridad alimentaria, también lo hace en lo que es seguridad energética y en la provisión o previsión de la disponibilidad que van a tener los países de algunos insumos claves, como decíamos, de los fertilizantes. Hoy estos temas están en el tope de la agenda mundial y es parte fundamental de la presentación que estamos por ver. Pero la invasión rusa no solo tiene efectos en el corto plazo, sino que este conflicto profundizó algunas tendencias que ya se venían viendo, son tendencias previas, y a su vez generó nuevas tendencias que se van a ir van a ir afectando el comercio de granos y la producción en los distintos países en los próximos años. Y en este mundo cada vez más complejo y desafiante, donde las incertidumbres parece ser la gran cuestión a monitorear, también va a corresponder a hacer análisis vinculado con las cuestiones de geopolítica, tanto como también un tema de agenda fundamental que Argentina lo ha encarado de manera decidida, como es la sustentabilidad y el cambio climático. Sobre estos desafíos y oportunidades vamos a estar hablando con un experto internacional que nos va a brindar su visión, de nada menos que estamos hablando del economista jefe del Departamento de Agricultura de Estados Unidos, el doctor Seth Meyer. Es un gusto para nosotros, es un verdadero honor para la Bolsa de Cereales recibirlo nuevamente en nuestra casa, esta vez de modo virtual. La vez pasada, hace unos años, fue de manera presencial en nuestra institución, quien nos va a brindar una visión de lo que él está viendo, cuáles son los componentes de oferta y demanda, qué está viendo de los distintos balances, qué está viendo del escenario mundial en ese lugar de privilegio que tiene, en el cual cuenta con muchísima información, no solo de Estados Unidos, sino de todo el mundo. El doctor Seth Meyer, como decía, actualmente economista jefe del Departamento de Agricultura, se desempeñó previamente como profesor invitado, como director asociado al Instituto FAPRI de la Universidad de Missouri, y previo a esta posición fue el líder, el presidente, podríamos decir, de la agencia del USDA, que realiza todos los meses el famoso informe que todos seguimos de manera muy detallada para ver qué está pasando con esta situación a veces de tirantez, a veces de más holgura en términos de oferta y demanda, y que termina afectando de manera decidida a los precios. El doctor Meyer además conoce muy bien Argentina, como les decía, en el 2015 nos visitó, y además de la charla que brindó en nuestra bolsa, tuvo la oportunidad de conocer los campos de nuestro país, estuvo recorriendo distintas partes de la zona agrícola, lo cual le dio la oportunidad de tener una primer mirada, al alcance, digamos, de su propia visión de cómo es el empresario agropecuario argentino, de cuáles son nuestros sistemas productivos, cómo llevamos adelante la producción en términos de sustentabilidad, de equipamiento, de tecnología que aplicamos. Y en una entrevista que dio pocos días después, fue interesante leer que se encontró con un campo que, según dijo, era muy parecido a lo que era su ciudad natal en el este de Iowa. Así que ahora voy a cambiar el inglés para darle la presentación a él formalmente y escucharlo para que nos dé su visión. Seth, welcome to the 7th Annual Agricultural Outlook Congress of the Buenos Aires Grain Exchange. Unfortunately, this is a virtual conference, so we are missing the opportunity to meet friends like you at coffee or lunch. But you know, this format allows us to do with a much broader audience, not only in Argentina, but also in the rest of the world. We are excited to welcome you to discuss the situation of the agricultural... la puta madre, vamos a tener que hacerlo de nuevo. Me trabé.
La parte de inglés arrancamos.
Sí, ¿arrancamos de ahí?
Sí.
Seth, welcome to the 7th Annual Agricultural Outlook Congress of the Buenos Aires Grain Exchange. Unfortunately, this is a virtual conference, so we are missing the opportunity to meet friends like you over the coffee or lunch, but this format allows us to do with a much broader audience across the agricultural sector, across Argentina, and around the world. We are excited to welcome you to discuss important issues related to the agricultural sector in addressing the food and ag sector's current and future challenges. In the previous panel, the Argentinian Ag Secretary and the President of the Buenos Aires Grain Exchange shared their views about the situation in the Black Sea, availability of fertilizer inputs, international prices, and also issues related with sustainability, productivity, and the challenges linked to the climate change. Now we are starting this panel about the situation of the economy and the world market. We are eager to hear your views as USDA Chief Economist, what you are seeing in agricultural supply and demand, and the recent impacts of global markets. Seth, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Ramiro. And again, greetings to all my colleagues and friends in Argentina. So I will provide you an outlook that is the same outlook that I might give to the Secretary as we produce our global supply and demand estimates. So we'll go around the world, but I'll add to this a little bit the views and concerns of U.S. agricultural producers. I will try to weave into that because, as you know, we have had a tremendous amount of volatility both in input and output prices in agriculture. And so in the United States, I want to give some context here in terms of farm income. What we are seeing in aggregate farm income in the United States shows farm income being quite strong. With that, low debt levels, currently the ability of producers to afford to pay for inputs, even though they are very high priced, but that does not remove the anxieties that producers feel as they look forward to the next crop year and experience higher input prices. So again, what we have seen, one of the important elements for agricultural markets in the United States and the world in general has been very strong demand. And in the US, this demand rebound has come quite a bit from improved export markets for us in the United States, where we are looking at a record export year followed by a pretty consistent, the second largest export year, maybe a modest decline, but not much. Demand has been an important element to this point in agricultural markets. I often show this slide also when talking about agricultural markets because it is useful to remind people that it is not war in the Ukraine alone which has introduced this volatility into the market. We can go all the way back to the fall of 2020 and see rising commodity prices. As China came back into our market and global market more generally, we saw rising corn and soybean prices. We also see some rising prices due to smaller South American soybean crops. And finally, you can very clearly see the additional effects on wheat prices from the war in Ukraine. But it hasn't just been agricultural commodities that have experienced a large amount of volatility. We see similar volatility in our fertilizer prices, a market which is fairly globally integrated, and we see energy prices also rising in the last 12 months or so. So what we can see is we've got a number of events, including commodity prices, but more broadly, fertilizer and energy prices as well, too. So in the US, while we might express that farm income is likely to look pretty good this year, it is not without a significant increase in costs. When we look at the individual expense categories for producers in the United States, normally this slide would have a line somewhere in the middle, and everything above the line would say these prices increased, and everything below the line would say these prices decreased this crop year. You notice there is no line. Every single major category of input expenses is increasing in price, and this is part of the anxiety which producers face. Some of these increases in price are substantial. Fertilizer up more than 50%, fuels and oils up more than 40%, increases in individual input categories. So as we go around and talk about individual categories for crop production, I think we need to keep in mind that those input prices will likely remain elevated into the new year. And as we look at where the crop situation is, we'll be concerned about both output and input prices for producers. So I think let's start talking with wheat, because I think that has been the topic primarily on the front of people's minds. And when one looks at this, indeed, we think we will close out this 22-23 marketing year with a crop size which had a small increase year over year, despite the significant cut in Ukrainian production. That cut in Ukrainian production, partly offset by a record large Russian wheat crop. But when we look at this, we say, okay, we have expanding production around the world, and that will offer additional supplies. However, I think it is important to say that the world wheat crop remains on edge. We have seen and continue to change and need to change our evaluation of Ukraine and its effect on global wheat, corn, and other crop markets. We started out being very concerned with the ports being closed, wondering if the Ukrainians would get into the field and plant their spring crops and how they would be able to harvest their winter crops. It's fair to say that the Ukrainians made a Herculean effort in getting the crop in, and will need to make a Herculean effort to harvest that crop. We have seen that before the war, the Ukrainians could export between 5 and 7 million metric tons of grains a month. In the immediate aftermath of the war, they could perhaps do 2 million metric tons a month. And even with the port opening, we see something around 3 million metric tons a month being able to move under the current grain deal. So the Ukrainians will continue to have difficulty in bringing their grain to market under these conditions, and will eventually have to rationalize production within the country, given input prices and the ability to move the crop out. So what has gone from an uncertainty about how long this will affect Ukraine's ability to supply the global market to something that may last into the next season. On top of that, we've seen the battlefield in Ukraine become much more dynamic, and that adds a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And also we've seen comments about the grain deal, which may suggest additional uncertainty of whether they will continue to be able to use those 3 ports I've circled in the south. This continues to be a source of uncertainty. And I'll remind everybody that in agriculture, we are used to the vagaries of weather and the uncertainty of droughts and production. This is very different in terms of we can have day-to-day shifts in what we think the Ukrainians will be able to move. This has been an additional amount of uncertainty in a market that is already tight. And so when we look at global wheat stocks, you will see this as being a general theme, which is while we are increasing production on a global level, it is our expectation that we will actually close out this next wheat marketing year with smaller stocks than we started. So in wheat, like you will see as I talk about other crops, that the tightness in agricultural markets and uncertainty is likely to last into the next season. So because when we look at global supply and demand balances here from our own WASDE report, while we are increasing production, you will note that again here our expectation is that we will actually end with the ending stocks in 22-23 will fall. We will continue to keep the wheat market tight throughout the next crop year. This is a chart which really looks at volatility. And so while the war has introduced a significant amount of volatility into the wheat market, it hasn't just been wheat markets. It's also been lots of volatility in other crop markets. So the orange line is current volatility as measured through our domestic options market. And you can see that compares it to the gray area, which is the range over the last 10 years. So you can see for much of this past year that volatility in wheat prices has exceeded the maximum over the previous 10 years. And for corn, it's been at or near or above that same range for corn volatility. So while we can experience while clearly war in Ukraine has added volatility, that volatility has not been isolated just to wheat markets. When we look at global corn production, I think the most recent event of note is a shrinking of our own crop in the United States, which I will talk about. But when you look at this list and you look at the number projected for Argentina and you look at the number projected for Brazil, remember that I am looking at this balance sheet for the coming Brazilian crop as part of the 22-23 year, or the coming Argentine crop. So these are crops which are still in the mind of South American producers. And even here, the assessment is a smaller crop. One of the big adjustments in our last outlook in the United States was 10 million metric tons less of production than we had forecast the prior month, and 30 million metric ton decline year over year. So this had been a signal to the market, which is while prices have come down from those wartime highs, prices remain at fairly elevated levels. And here too, while we may grow stocks at a global level, or at least in the exporting countries, it is not a large rebound in stocks. And remember, this is what the market will close with if we have a normal crop or a trend crop in South America. And again, even with that trend crop, which is a bigger crop in Brazil and a rebound crop in Argentina, we expect to further tighten global markets in aggregate for all ending stocks. In exporting countries, it will be roughly flat. In all countries, it'll be a slight decline. So again, this is a tightness in corn markets, which is likely to last for many more months. And again, assuming we get a normal crop out of South America. Now, in the United States, we had seen our condition of our crop decline pretty sharply over the growing season. It is normal that the condition rating for this crop declines over time. You have an accumulation of problems in a normal year, so it tends to come down some, but what you have seen is a pretty noticeable decline in corn conditions over the growing season. So as an expectation, it was not surprising that when we went in and looked at our yields, that we began to change and cut those yield estimates from the previous month and cut them pretty widely. You can see most areas west of the Mississippi in the United States showing declines in yields from the prior August estimate. The West in the United States continues to experience significant drought and a wide range of conditions in that U.S. corn crop. But I will tell you from that last report that our estimate that the yield at the United States would be 172.5 bushels an acre, that was not unexpected. Folks had observed the declining conditions and guessed that we would have a slightly below trend yield this year. But what did surprise them was our overall production number, because NASS made a large downward revision of 1.3 million acres in terms of overall corn area. So this last report, we got both a decline in yield and a decline in area. When you look at this chart, the blue dot is what the traders thought we were going to say. Every blue dot is an observation of a trade organization. The red square is the actual estimate. So again, the size of the crop was a surprise. The yield was not, but the decline in corn planted and corn harvested area provided that spark of a bit of a price strength based upon the size of the US production number. So again, it is a smaller crop, significantly smaller crop than last year. We have had smaller crops recently, but it is certainly at the bottom end of the range, in the lower part of the range for corn production in the United States. And as such, when we look at our balance sheet, we had to start the 22-23 crop year in the United States with 400 million bushels less production. Now, some of that came out of stocks, but some of it had to come out of other uses. And the result is we are looking at an ending stock number of about 1.2 billion bushels, which is very tight in the domestic market. That's a pretty tight number given where we're at in the global market situation. So, but it wasn't, it wasn't that the area that came out of corn was mistakenly, it was in corn, but it was really in beans. That is not the case because soybean area was also taken down about 600,000 acres. And here too, it was not the market's guess about yield. It was the surprise area adjustment that shrunk the US soybean crop. So here, when you take those two together, we had about 2 million acres less of corn and soybeans planted than we had originally estimated. And that is the surprise on the market for production. And here in the United States, it isn't as if there is about a flat year over year soybean acreage that will be harvested. Again, a surprise here, that number was more like 88 million acres planted prior to this latest estimate. So again, the surprise of the report coming out from the smaller acreage in the United States. Here, that still gives us a large soybean crop, one of the larger soybean crops, the third largest soybean crop, the fourth largest soybean crop on record, but still a pretty good crop. So despite the fact that we have cut acreage, still a good sized soybean crop in the United States. When we look around the world here, though, again, this is the important reminder that when we talk about the global balance sheet for soybeans, it is important to remember that we are expecting, or we forecast, a more normal crop out of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay for soybean production at a global level. And in doing so, we would have a strong rebound in overall global production. But to get that strong rebound, we're going to need good crops out of South America. And so with those big crops, and when we look at things like increasing global crush demand, we do expect with a normal South American crop that we will have growing global ending stocks. We have had a good rebound in the imports of soybeans into China. We have had to reduce those estimates for the 22-23 crop year by a few million metric tons, as the expectation is the pace will be a bit slower, but still a rebound on crushing and feeding of soybean meal within the country for the 22-23 crop year. And again, at a global level, an expectation that ending stocks will rise for soybeans. But that's not the case in the United States. While we expect that global ending stocks will rise, it will not largely be the United States that will make the largest contributor to that. Part of when we look at that ending stocks rise is when we count South American stocks. So part of it's your rebound in production. But here in the United States too, we expect that our crush will continue to increase. Domestic crush in the United States has been very strong, and so our estimate of our carry-out stocks in soybeans is that we will further reduce ending stocks. And we are looking here that this year that we will have about a $14 per bushel soybean price that farmers will receive, which gives us about a 2.1 soybean to corn ratio, quite low relative to our recent history, which means corn is having some additional price strength relative to soybeans. Part of this is obviously that area constraint and that falling ending stocks. It also would suggest perhaps a need to have a lower price ratio given the higher input costs for corn. Soybean crush margins in the United States have been very, very strong. And I think this is an important part of our story domestically. Here you can see that crush margins are running well above what they have been in the prior 3 or 4 years. Just incredible strength in terms of crush margins. We are building crush capacity as a result, but here we would crush yet more if we had the capacity given these margins. Part of that strength, or a significant part of that strength, is also that oil value is leading the way. What you see here in blue for the average of 2017 to 2020, that's pretty normal historically. What we have seen is the oil value of the bean, the oil carrying a much larger weight in the overall value of the bean. Oil demand domestically has been strong. That is, part of that is consumer demand, but part of it is also our additional capacity being built in renewable biodiesel. So part of this is biodiesel strength adding to that oil value and price rise. So crush demand being very strong, capacity growing, oil prices and oil value in the bean rising, even relative to other global oil prices, the US soybean oil prices showing more strength than the normal relationship to other oils. So here, this is a driver in our oil seed market. And here's our oil supply, soybean oil supply and demand balance. And I just want to point out that biofuel use, indeed, we forecast that growth will continue to expand. That 21-22 number is up sharply from the previous year, and yet we expect there to be yet a further increase, a little, about 15% year-over-year increase in soybean oil use for biodiesel. We had lots of discussion about capacity that could have made that increase yet larger, but these higher prices for soybean oils have trimmed demand and expectation, slowed the growth in biodiesel production. But I also think, more recently, for many months, we didn't talk much about rice. We didn't talk much about rice in terms of the market was well supplied, and it was actually a good thing. We had lots of volatility in corn and wheat and soybeans, and at least we thought maybe rice was one area where we had less concern. But what we have observed is that our estimate that said we may get growing production in 22-23 has slowly come down over time to where we actually expect production in this next crop year to be lower than the prior year. And troubling as well, too, are the reactions by some countries when they have supply disruptions. We had seen strongly growing production in India of rice year over year. They were using that in part into putting it into the export market. They had very dry conditions over the northern areas, which are significant rice productions, and as a result, have put in export controls on certain grades or processed rices, and that has brought volatility into the rice market as well, too. I think that the Argentines and the American farmers would probably both agree that export controls are not the right action when it comes to calming global markets and ensuring food security for the most vulnerable. So here we've got, export controls which go into place, and now I think brought rice closer to the other grains in terms of potential volatility. As such, we had many years of growing rice production in India, and this is India's rice production, and the first time down 3% from the prior year, and the first year in several years where we've had a contraction in production. Not a huge production decline, down 3%, but the reaction by India also adding volatility back into the global market. So, in conclusion, the global balance sheets for corn and wheat likely to remain tight through this next crop year. Rice markets have been drawn into that volatility. I find it a bit troubling, and I want to, make the message that export controls are often the wrong action to take in the face of global market volatility. While global soybean stocks are likely to increase with the normal South American crop, U.S. crush demand is robust here in the United States. And when I say with a normal South American crop, I think the market needs a normal South American crop, that trend crop which will put bigger supplies onto the global market. And I'm sure you are having many other sessions, Ramiro, talking about global tight supplies, economic uncertainty. Here we have a strong US dollar, we have rising interest rates, we have concerns about global demand through economic conditions in the rest of the world, and we have a more dynamic war in Ukraine. So we have lots of concerns about the demand for agricultural commodities and their output price. And at the same time, we have large concerns about fuel and fertilizer prices as producers go into the field, as they are here. I am in the Midwest of the United States, and harvest is underway. Farmers are already thinking about the next crop and are experiencing higher input prices with uncertainty about output prices, which continues to gives the producers some anxiety, even if the results from this campaign they are just completing is positive. Thank you, Ramiro.
I think you said so much on behalf of the members of the Buenos Aires Grain Exchange. I want to thank you for your insightful presentation. You really clarified us difficult topics that are affecting global markets, and your presentation generated enough interest to make you, 50 to 60 questions. But don't worry, I don't think I have time for that. So maybe let's go quickly to the Q&A section, and let's start with the soybean complex, if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the United States has been strongly promoting the U.S. biofuels crushing, and in fact, much of the increase in soybean crushing capacity has been due to increased production of soybean biodiesel. So do you think is there room to continue growing? Are there possibilities of importing oil to transform it into biodiesel in the US?
So I think there is room for growth. And this may be, I think the details here are important. The growth in biodiesel production capacity in the United States is in a process called renewable diesel. Okay, there is a traditional FAME production, which tends to be small plants in the Midwest. These are very large scale plants located on the coasts next to petroleum refineries. Okay, why does that matter? This process uses refined soybean oil, not crude soybean oil like FAME, which makes importation of soybean oil to run these processes more difficult, and also narrows their choice of feedstocks. Mm-hmm. They are also getting benefits from not only national US policy, but California style biofuel policies as well. So I think that there are lots of plans for expanding growth in production process facilities, but we have seen there were a lot on paper. Only some of them have been completed. So while I think we will continue to see potential growth, it will be slower than they had announced.
Okay.
And maybe the process expands, but the inputs are somewhat narrow, right? Soybean oil, refined soybean oil is where some of that growth is.
Perfect. Thank you. Let's move to another topic, important one. Beyond the general economic setting, you mentioned several uncertainties this year that have a direct impact on the outlook for crops. Questions about policy, trade, weather, and the Black Sea situation, all are having an impact, making ag projections less certain than perhaps any time since, I don't know, many, many years. So what do you think should be the role of net exporting countries like Argentina in this scenario?
So I think the most important element of this, is being reliable suppliers, right? Being consistent and being reliable suppliers. To me, that is the role of the Argentines, of the Americans, of the Canadians, of the Brazilians, right? I mentioned you have provided me another opportunity to say export controls are bad, right? Slamming the door on exports to try and insulate your consumers not only usually does not work in the long run, it also transmits that volatility into the least developed countries, the countries who are most vulnerable. So in the short run, I think that Argentina, Brazil, United States, Canada, we need to continue to be consistent as reliable suppliers.
Yeah.
On top of that, I think that this also provides us an opportunity to remind folks that there are a lot of benefits to increasing productivity through technology, right? There are not only benefits to providing for food security, there are climate benefits from actually taking advantage of productive technologies which can limit land expansion and provide that global food security. So, reliable suppliers, keep thinking about how we're going to do it all better, cleaner, faster, and more efficiently.
Perfect. Before going to the productivity section, I would like to go more deep in this part of the be reliable. I think that the war in Ukraine has led to reformulate political alliances around the world. On agricultural issues, there is a certain harmony between the countries of the Americas. You mentioned Brazil, US, Argentina. And based on this, can there be more joint work between the countries of the American continent?
So I think that we have to, when we think about our relationship with Brazil and Argentina and Canada and ourselves, I think it is to put forward this message that reliability is important, but productivity is important as well too. We cannot, I think that the last couple of years have also proven that that one cannot take for granted the supplies at a global level and the growing needs of the world. Demand has been strong. You know, some other countries may have said, well, we'll talk about this rotation, or we'll talk about these other alternatives for sustainability. I think what this has told us is we in the northern and southern part of the Americas are interested in maintaining productivity, technology growth, and supplying that market. We've seen what happens when we don't have that productivity. But you're right, we have seen some, the war in Ukraine is a completely man-made event that has shocked markets. It is not like we are not used to productivity shocks in agriculture. This one's different. But again, I think the answer here is be reliable and be productive. I hate to keep pushing on that, but I think that is the key.
Okay, let's talk to the sustainable agenda. You know, on the one hand, there is a growing interest in the private sector and among consumers for food that is grown in a climate-friendly way. On the other hand, we have many challenges. You know, input prices and other costs continue to rise, drought conditions, and so on and on. So I wonder many things related with this. Can sustainable agricultural practices help farmers, producers to save money? Or how innovative agricultural practices can help farmers?
So I think it's a great question, Ramiro. I'm an economist, and I think at USDA we very clearly understand when sustainability comes into people's mind, they often think climate or emissions, but it also has to be economically sustainable for producers, or they won't do it. They'll go out of business, and we'll see further problems with production, right? We'll continue to have global tight supplies. So I think in the US, the way we envision this is if one applies technologies, one can be both sustainable. One could take high efficiency fertilizers. One could better rationalize the use of fertilizers, reduce the environmental impacts, improve productivity, so we can meet multiple objectives through the application of this technology.
I was saying, with the Paris Agreement, the climate change and sustainability agenda are here to stay. You know, the United States, with its return to the agreement, has reinforced its commitment to climate action. I know USDA has many tools to help ag producers mitigate climate risk and weather disasters. Last week, Agricultural Secretary Tom Vilsack announced that the Biden-Harris administration, through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, is investing up to $2.8 billion in 70 selected projects related with the climate smart commodity funding. So do you consider that this effort will increase the competitive advantages of the U.S. agricultural, both domestically and internationally?
So I think another great question. I see these projects, I characterize these projects as being investigating how to serve these markets if this is what the consumers are asking for. This is not about dictating practices for US producers. It's to talk about, can we measure some of these practices? Do these practices accomplish the environmental goals that consumers want? And then if they do, how do we link consumers to that demand and producers, so producers get to share in the value created that consumers see in that product? So I think for the US, it is a way to say there will be global consumers who demand this. Let's put ourselves in a position that if those consumers are willing to pay for that product, that we are able to serve that market. So these projects are very much meant to, let's measure this. Let's quantify it in terms of what it actually does. Let's figure out how this arrangement between producers and consumers can be made legally, environmentally, supply chains to get those products to market. It is very much about saying, what are the challenges of this market? How can we help producers access this market if this is the signal that they are getting from consumers that they want?
Crystal clear. I think I have time for one last question. Let's turn to the Farm Bill. The current Farm Law, the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018, was signed on December 20 of 2018 and will remain in force through 2023. We are aware that the new version of it is being worked on. So what can we expect it from it?
So I will tell you that while technically maybe it should be due in 2023, it is possible. I have limited insight into when they intend to finish, but I will add that they are trying to construct a farm bill in a pretty challenging time, first of all. And second of all, there are lots of new ideas coming to the table. They will have to be evaluated. So I would say 2023 is the target, but they will spend the time they need in order to get it right. And I think right now is a very challenging time to put this together. Just think that many of the US farm programs rely on price to say, hey, this is a safety net. Well, when input prices are highly volatile, some producers will say, well, the output price isn't as meaningful as output and input prices. So there are all these ideas coming in an environment of high volatility. So at the Office of the Chief Economist, we're always willing to provide our technical assistance to the legislators. And I think they have a big challenge in front of them. So it would not surprise me if they take their time and they get it right. But there will be, perhaps, I characterize the last Farm Bill as being evolutionary, not revolutionary. It evolved from the prior Farm Bill. It will be very interesting to see if we have further evolution or whether it is a more drastic step.
Okay. Well, Seth, Meyer, thank you very much for the time. I really appreciate it. I could keep talking with you for hours, but we are already a few minutes over. I want to give you the last 2 minutes for any closing comments that you may want to share. And again, thank you so much for your time.
So I think I've given you my outlook. All I would like to do is send my greetings to the Argentine farmers and producers, and also say, hey, I think that now is an opportunity for some countries like Argentina, Brazil, US, Canada, Australia, to remind folks that being productive is a good thing, and it can be good for the environment, and it could be good for global consumers. And then I'll also say, I am looking forward to the time where we can be together in person in Argentina, and we can have some barbecue. I am very much looking forward to it.
You're always welcome here, Seth. Le agradecemos a Seth Meyer, economista jefe del Departamento de Agricultura de Estados Unidos, por su tiempo y por brindarnos esta interesantísima charla que claramente nos expuso de una manera clara cuáles son los principales desafíos e incertidumbres que presenta el mercado agrícola mundial y en particularmente aquellos impactos que tienen alguna vinculación con nuestra situación aquí en Argentina. A continuación, le damos el pase al panel número 2 de esta mañana, el comercio agroindustrial frente a la geopolítica y las nuevas demandas. Va a estar moderado por el doctor Nelson Ilescas, director de la Fundación INAI, y va a estar compuesto por 2 panelistas, Norberto Pontiroli, de Argentina Global, y Sabine Papendiek, coordinadora del programa argentino de carbono neutro. Muchísimas gracias.